The Fold is brought to you by O Media, making brands unmissable and public spaces better across Aotearoa. No mai, hoki mai ki a The Fold, e mihi nei ko Duncan Greive tōku ingoa. My guest this week is Milly Olykan, who I met, full disclosure, I met less than 24 hours ago, and I'm now basically obsessed with a very me situation. But she's the VP of International Relations and Development, which is a job title that makes you sound like a diplomat or a spy or something, for the Country Music Association in Nashville. It's really hard to overstate her power and influence. She's actually a New Zealander, born and raised in Canterbury, came up through a circuitous path that she describes through the industry, including managing the Brunettes when they were signed to Sub Pop, and kind of a big deal. But she basically has always had to scratch and claw her way in, but now she is in the citadel, probably the most kind of insular, storied kind of infrastructure and community part of the entire pop music industrial complex. And country music, which obviously the Country Music Association exists to propagate, is having a real moment. I've been kind of working my way into it over the past probably 10, 15 years, ever since I first heard Taylor Swift's Fearless, and then Sam Hunt's Montevallo particularly. It's a kind of maligned genre, and a lot of it isn't for me, but the best of it has its hooks into me like the best kind of R&B does. It's just a really singular kind of music that has its own codes and laws. But it used to be hard to get to. It was just, it wasn't particularly interested in telling its story to you, but partly as a result of the rise of Spotify and YouTube as music discovery vehicles, it's had this kind of rolling explosion over the past few years, to the point where, as of right now, artists like Morgan Wallen and Luke Combs, who played Spark Arena last night, extraordinary show, which I reviewed for the Spinoff last week, they have kind of, they're sort of dominating the culture in a way that's the only kind of real comparison is the rise of Latin music, likes of Bad Bunny and so on. But it's just, there is just something happening there, and it's not an accident. And really, I got Milly on to explain the story of her career, which is also, particularly over the last 5-10 years, explains the story of country music's rise and how it's been this kind of very resilient cultural business kind of manufacturing approach that's really, really still largely operating as it probably did 60 or 70 years ago. And I think there are huge lessons in that for every aspect of the media, in terms of both creation and how that product is then connected to fans. If it's not already obvious, I really, really enjoyed this. I think Milly is probably one of the New Zealand media's, this is me having discovered her about 10 minutes ago, but the most underappreciated international success stories. I'm so thrilled to have her on the podcast. So this is Milly Olykan, the VP of International Relations and Development at the Country Music Association, on The Fold. Kia ora, Milly. Welcome to The Fold.
Oh, thanks for having me.
So I wondered if you could start by explaining, what your job title is and what that job entails.
Well, my title is VP of International Relations and Development. It's and I work for the Country Music Association of America, based in Nashville. It's a long title, and it really involves, the short version is, how do we help export country music around the world, But I really need to back up and talk about the Country Music Association. Country music has a trade association, and it's got a cool backstory because it was launched over 60 years ago because country music used to be really strong in America on the radio, and then Elvis Presley showed up and all these radio stations started converting over to rock and roll And so the music business got together, the country music business, and said, we've got to actually form an association to protect the genre. And that's how it was born. So jump forward 60 years, it's now like we're in the streaming world. How do we export our genre? How do we make sure that it succeeds in other markets? And that's where I come in.
It's so interesting, and the fact of it being a trade association, I think, is actually sort of speaks to a lot of why country sort of feels and behaves differently as a sort of a genre and a community to other forms of music to some extent, which I really want to dig into. But I want to actually sort of back the truck up a bit on you first, because you're not, your accent betrays you. You're not from Nashville. What was your path to the CMA?
First of all, I like to back the truck up. I noticed that. I think it's a long story, isn't it? When we're all getting older, it's a very long story now.
That's all right. We've got nothing but time on this podcast.
That's another country music song right there. Jeez. Okay, so. Yeah, I'm a country kid, but I had dreams of the entertainment business in one way, shape, or form. And really, I loved music and bands. And at one point, I just realized I could do something in that. And I really started striving towards working in the music business. I didn't know it was the music business. I mean, like you, we all reading the back of record sleeves and reading about fan clubs and managers and stuff. I thought, I'd like to do something like that. How do I do it? So
it requires a kind of naivety to even attempt it, right?
Yeah, which went along the lines of walking up to a band after a gig and saying, "Can I volunteer and help you guys?" And then managing that band when I was 21, and they were the Strange Loves from Dunedin. They were signed to Flying Nun, and learning. And in the meantime, I was working at the Fortune Theatre. I moved to Dunedin. I had a kind of a drama kick for a long time, and then pivoted to music. And then I started. I learned how to, I guess you could say, manage a band. I learned how to book a band around New Zealand, and that led to, I was due to do my OE. I always wanted to do my OE. And then when I did that and came back, I'm like, right, I'm going to get serious, and this is going to be my career.
Amazing. And then still, that leaves it's quite a long way from I'm going to make this my career to being in the very specific hothouse environment that is Nashville.
I didn't really fill in. That's what I feel like. It's a long story.
I want the long story.
When I look back on my time in Auckland, so I moved back. We're talking early 90s here, and moved to Auckland. And I was just banging on the doors trying to get in the music business. I had left school at high school. I don't have any education beyond that. And so that's what I was doing. I was just trying to get in. I would have loved to have worked for a record label or something like that. But I just wanted to be in the business. And I ended up getting in working for New Zealand Musician magazine. It was my first real music job. And no offence to anyone associated with that magazine, but it's kind of the poor man's version of getting into the music business. However, it meant I got to go to everything. I was at those press conferences that we used to have back then, and I got to know everybody working in the business, and I was one of those people that nerded out on who's who in the business and things like that. And I learned things about my own skill set, that I was really good at organising stuff and pulling things together. I wasn't good at writing. I wanted to do what you started doing, which was actually, write about music, but I actually wasn't any good at it. But I had to go. But then I also knew I wanted to, I wanted to do it all. It sounds like when I'm talking about it like this, but
that's what you're like in your 20s,
Yeah.
And it feels like it's all just there open for you.
Yeah. The live side of it, putting on a gig, going to shows, like that experience, I always call it the audio-visual experience. It's not just about listening, it's watching that performance, connecting.
And the show that is made between the audience and the performer, right?
Yeah.
We saw a pretty good one last night, which we'll talk about in a bit. But yeah, so I still don't kind of quite see how you go from like the indie scene in Auckland to whatever the kind of reverse polarity of that is.
All
Has
right.
to be Nashville.
I'll try and fast forward through this. But so I ended up working various music industry jobs, but managing bands on the side, being passionate about artists. And one of the bands that I started managing was a band called the Brunettes.
Know them well.
Yeah. And so there was just a moment. It was a time when music was going from its kind of electronic self back to its guitar-y self, and you know how it does that thing every now and again. And, again, looking back, I just was very, very, very focused on I'm going to get this band out of New Zealand. We've got to get to a bigger market. We all know we're at the bottom of the world and everything else is happening somewhere else. And I wasn't going to stop it in Australia because bands would go to Australia and they'd never leave. So we've got to get to London. And so we went to London. Let's forget all the bits about how to raise the money to get a band to London and where do you stay when you're in London and all that stuff and how you get gigs. But we, and I was thinking about this earlier today for some reason about how back then I would literally send CDs all over the world to record labels, and that's how you had to get in front of people. I was thinking about it in regards to Nashville, how different it is there, and we will get to that. But a CD that I sent from Auckland landed in the offices of Sub Pop Records in Seattle. But when the band went to London, we ended up connecting with the Sub Pop folks who fell in love with the Brunettes and then cut to a few years later, signed them, cut to touring around America in a van with a lot of brunettes, and 1,000 experiences that really shaped me, shaped them. And, you have that formative thing. But meanwhile, I had a career, I had to earn money, I had to actually go back to it. So I did that on the side for a long time. And then in the meantime, I stayed in London. They went back and I started to develop my career in London, which basically means start from scratch.
Absolutely.
Bang on the doors and ask for jobs, basically. So then I eventually found my way in through the back door, the poor man's version of the music business in London, which is no offence to anyone working in classical music, but that's the only way I could get in. I got a job in a classical music company. Of course, I still know nothing about classical music, but I did end up producing a classical music festival in Italy, and there's other stories in there. But by that time, I'm like, this is where I belong. I'm back. I'm working. I'm putting on shows. I'm thinking about interesting programming that could add to that festival. I know I'm leaving out a lot of detail here.
You kind of have to in some respects,
Yeah.
but it also does speak to how the sort of doggedness of you and the passion, but which all kind of does feel like it's extremely relevant to both how you would end up in country and how you'd develop it's a very underdog music in a lot of ways. It's, in a lot of spaces it really has to fight, and it feels like that quality that's in you is very present in the music that, it feels like you must feel at home on some level.
It's actually, that's a nice way to connect it. And I think a lot of us, people working in the music business, and I would say in media, you have to keep striving, you have to keep going. And I think that's actually how we work in the music business for the most part. And so I think that's also part of being a New Zealander as well. I think just pushing, like when you know that you have to prove yourself. And I'm now living in Nashville. I lived in the UK for 15 years. I think that also shapes us when you have to kind of show that you can do it, and don't forget that I'm not from here. It's okay, I can still do this kind of thing. There's something about pushing through that as well. But the connection, the jump between a festival in Italy and country music is the quick steps are, and there's a nice little name drop I'm about to do here, and I don't like to do that, but I'm going to do it. I had an opportunity to work with Sundance Film Festival and actually help bring a little piece of Sundance Film Festival to London. And that was a connection I established with working with Robert Redford on the Classical Music Festival.
Wow. That's quite a name. If
Yeah.
you're going to drop one,
Yeah.
make it big.
It's a beautiful name to drop. So that was a dogged situation of trying to, and we had a partnership with what was the venue, the O2 in London, the big
Yeah.
venue in London, to bring a very indie, cool film festival, a slice of it into not a very, like a difficult venue to do that, and it has cinemas within that venue. But I produced Sundance London for 3 years, and then the venue, the O2, were like, we want to hire you to bring other things into this venue and build other bespoke content for that. I hate calling events content, but there you go. And I tried various things, and by this point I'm trying to develop large-scale festivals or something into the O2 in London. And I had a lot of failures, but one of the ones that I tried on behalf of AEG, who I was working for, was to build a country music festival. And I did it with 2 other individuals who, the 3 of us, we built a festival called Country to Country. So now I'm working in country music. I know nothing about country music at this point.
Really?
Yeah.
So that's really crazy because that brand still exists, right?
Oh, yeah. The Country to Country is a hugely successful festival.
Which is amazing.
Yeah, it's in the O2. It takes place in 3 cities in the UK at the same time. It's travelled to Amsterdam and Berlin, and it actually is one of the pivoting moments for Nashville to start thinking about we can tour now. We can leave Nashville because there's a place that can promote us, and it's So backing up, I had to do a deep dive into getting familiar with who's who in country music, and then fell in love with it. Actually, I think people who love songs and music and have always liked the lyrics, you're going to find your way into country music pretty easily, and that legitimate connection.
So how long did it take them to sort of suck you back to the mothership in Nashville?
Well, that festival, Country to Country, launched in 2013, and I produced the first 6 of those. And in the meantime, I would start going to Nashville. I got elected to the CMA board, which is a big deal.
Incredible. For some, I can
For a
imagine
foreigner.
there'll be a lot of people who want that and who'd look sideways at you.
Yeah, and that was, then you're walking into a room of the people who run the music business. And I would do that and continue to build the festival elements, which were amazing and gave artists real platforms to be discovered in the UK. Small artists could come and play that festival and build a fan base instantly. And after doing that for a period of time, I did think the creative bit had gone out of it for me, and I was looking for something else, and the CMA offered me a job because I now had an expertise of how to build a country, find the audience for country music in a market that really doesn't have country music. And so that's a good expertise to take to Nashville and use internationally. So that's where we are.
Which is incredible, right? Because I think that if you, and this is just my sort of read on it, is one of the things that defines country music and the trade association being kind of emblematic of it is it's a real infrastructure sort of genre, city, community, and what you have, what defines the reality of country music in most countries around the world is none of that infrastructure exists. So your very specific expertise and how to sort of build that out is obviously of huge value to a music that can seem quite insular and inward looking from the outside at times. And so it's quite a significant role. But so I really want to dig, there's a lot, right? I want to dig into it. But before we do, can you just explain, like Nashville for most of us is not a place we visit or might never, but it sort of sings in our mind a bit as this idea as much as anything. Can you describe what it's like living and working there and watching country music operate as an industry and a business?
Yeah. Well, I visited Nashville a lot, but I didn't really understand it till I moved there. The big thing I didn't understand, even though everyone said it all the time, is that country music is really built around radio in America. So it's a machine that operates, you have to get radio play in order, even in the world of streaming. It's all about getting an artist on the radio. Okay, so that's an aside. Let's just park that for a while. But yeah, it's not called Music City for no reason. I feel like I've got that sentence wrong. It's called Music City for a reason. I mean, I'm probably taking it for granted now, but it's true. I see people walking around with guitars down the street. I look out my office window and I will see people walking past with a guitar strapped on their back and a hat on sometimes. They are going to write songs. If you show up in Nashville as a songwriter, you're going to want to get a publishing deal, and that's the first thing you try and do. If you can get a publishing deal, you will get paid a certain amount of money to write a certain amount of songs in a year or so, or in a period. And so you go from 11 a.m. in the morning till 4 p.m. and you go to your publisher and they will put you in with other people to write songs. Now, if you show up in Nashville, you're a nobody, and you're going to be put with other similar people, including artists that are still trying to build a career and are basically nobodies. But if that artist gets somewhere, you could be going with them as a songwriter. So there's one kind of vertical of how it works. So meantime, in Nashville, publishers, business managers, record labels, publicists, anybody who works and touches an artist in country music is constantly trying to pitch them at you. And it's not necessarily transactional. So I will always be invited to come and see an artist perform. And people will want me to meet an artist. That's the difference in the genre. In indie and in kind of rock and roll or whatever, you don't really, as an artist, you don't really meet business people. They never make sure you meet.
They're almost squeamish about it,
yeah,
right?
It's like, keep it away. That's not cool.
Yeah.
This is all about, you've got to meet Milly. And she's got to make a connection with you, and then she knows who you are. And it's like, so my point is, like, when I first got a bank account in Nashville, I went into the bank, and it actually looked like a record label foyer. It was covered in gold records. Turns out I walked myself into a personal banking situation where there's only two tellers and there's no one else in there, and it's very personal. But I've even had people who work in the bank talk about an artist that they're championing. And so it's kind of almost hard to explain, but it's everyone takes the role like you might think of a manager doing, or you might think of, oh, we've just got to pitch them to this label. No, you just pitch them to everyone in the business constantly. So, and when I say pitch, it's the wrong word. You make sure people are making a connection with your artist all the time. And so, the other thing that blows my mind is that any show, like if Chris Stapleton plays or if Luke Combs plays or if Brandy Clark plays or if people play in Nashville, you get invited to that show. And so they must allocate it into their business plan that there's going to be 500 seats at this stadium show that just go to the industry because we want the industry to come, every part of it. I'm possibly not even doing it justice, but just take my word for it. Well, it's everywhere. It operates. It's a community. It really is. Like, I know that we know Nashville as, you think Nashville is all about music. Its biggest business is actually healthcare, but you don't know that. You know it's all about music. So just imagine a city the size of Auckland that's primary business is music.
But I think it's so interesting because I've so long had this. It sort of irked me the extent to which the money and how the business is conducted is something that people are squeamish about in New Zealand music a lot of the time. I think that has and is changing, and there are certain artists like 660, for example, who treat it very much like a job. They keep hours in the same way that you were describing songwriters doing. But I think it's actually, it seems to me that it's the country's benefit that it does take it seriously, that it doesn't believe that the artistry is compromised by proximity to a knowledge of how the sort of the money and the money is made and the careers are built. I mean, so for this thing, so it's one thing to kind of, I guess, fall in love with the music, but there must be also something about the way it goes about its business that got its hooks into you for you to make such a huge, profound kind of life move that way.
Yeah. I refer to moving to Nashville being a really soft landing. Moving to London, was like hard. That was hard. That was 5 years before you get anywhere. Now, obviously, I'm in a different point in my career moving to Nashville, but it's very hospitable. You're talking about southern states, they're very hospitable. You work in the music business, you're one of us. You're in. You just need to be introduced. All of my social network is in the music business, all of it. I don't know anyone who doesn't work in the music business in Nashville, and I've never had that through my whole life of working in the music business. I've always had people in my life most of my friends have not been in the music business, but that's what it's like in Nashville. So I really like that. I like how that we can collaborate, like being the Country Music Association, a board running a vision for the genre. Having all the competitors in the room, the labels, the streaming services, the publishers, even within that, there's a lot of conflict, I think, around royalties or whatever it is. We're all in the room and we are talking about the future. What is it that we can do to keep moving our genre forward, building the audience, making sure we're being inclusive? Those are the discussions, and I love that. I think about it, coming back to thinking about New Zealand, worked here. There's so many great songwriters in New Zealand. I think New Zealand music isn't a genre, clearly.
No.
Please, no. But it is a location that's isolated and there is a lot of talent here. In my experience, 20 years ago when I worked in New Zealand, it wasn't particularly collaborative. It's the opposite of that. It's you keeping yourself to yourself. You're being competitive because I know it's a small market. So you are competing. But if you could get your head around the greater good as we all succeed, let's do something together. I mean, I would just, whether it's songwriting or producing something really collaborative, I think in any music scene is going to help, is going to be a positive, and that's what we have in Nashville. It is, the concert we saw last night, the musicianship we saw, the songwriting, Luke Combs' whole album, it's so clever. All of the big albums that are coming out in Nashville at the moment, Morgan Wallen's album, it's so faultless. And it's because that whole songwriting craft honing, and by the way, if you're those hit songwriters, the big artists get to work with the best songwriters. So it's not, the big songwriters don't work with just anyone. So you have levels of songwriters. So the A-listers work with the A-listers, and then obviously every songwriter is trying to get up there to be able to be writing with the big artists.
The thing that kind of strikes me about your rise is that it does actually dovetail a period where country music has kind of cracked out of that sort of, we are, a music for, by, about these kind of southern states, and become something that's to the point where what we saw last night can happen. The idea that it still kind of makes my head kind of spin, the thinking about what we saw. So
should we talk about what we saw?
Shall we talk about what we saw? I mean, for you so what we saw last night was Luke Combs, this artist who, well, you explained him, because to see him, that show, as one of his promoters, Michael Choke, said, sold out in minutes over a year ago, and for any artist to do that on their first time is crazy. For one, to do it with no infrastructure and have such a passionate crowd, how did that look to you as someone who has seen a shitload of these artists in different locations?
Oh, well, I think how it looks to me is I have insider knowledge about what's happening here, because that's my job to know what's going on. And so I know that there are country fans in New Zealand that are not getting served anything. You know,
Anything at all. We got no
they don't
radio.
have radio.
We got no press.
There's no one interested in them. Artists aren't touring here for the most part, you know, because it's a long way away as well, let's face that. But there's no radio, there's no infrastructure. But there's some really passionate people in the music business here who want to see that change. And I'm connected with them. Luke Combs, as an artist, was very focused on being a global artist. And while he hasn't been to New Zealand, you know, in his very short career, that I think you said last night launched in 2014 or something like that, he's been to Australia 3 times.
That's atypical, right? Like that.
Yeah, that is. The tide is starting to change in that regard. So this goes back to the festival that I was part of launching. I think it was, right, let's just say mid-2000s, streaming's starting to, you know, streaming's been around for a while, but we were still, even 10 years ago, it wasn't it is now, weirdly. And I think that's when there was a desire for some artists to go beyond their border. And there were very few artists that wanted to do that. So going back to Luke Combs, he's been one of those artists from the get-go in his career. And what actually happened when that show went on sale a year ago, they could have sold 2 arenas easily.
Yeah, you could.
They could have.
The latent demand was manifestly
It went
there.
so quickly.
Yeah.
And then subsequently, he has released an album that is now, you know, he's got a #1 song in New Zealand right now. Like, that is even before that album came out. So you could say that, you know, if that show went on sale this week, would it be a stadium? Like, it's big. And so I've learned something while I've been in New Zealand. So my job is to really understand each market. And I know there's country fans there. I know Luke Combs and his current success has crossed over into music fans. You know, he's got a song. He's done the Tracy Chapman cover, Fast Car. That's a huge song in New Zealand right now. That's music fans. It's not just country music fans, right? So I went to that show expecting to see, it's going to be a mix. It wasn't.
It was not a mix at all. It was a pure crowd.
It was country people.
Yeah.
And let's talk about their age.
Young.
Yeah.
Real young. Like 20s, even early 20s.
Yeah.
That blew me away. Like, I was surrounded by this group, basically young, really attractive couples, super into each other and having their moment with this guy. And, you know, I go to a lot of shows at Spark. I've never seen a crowd that was that sort of specific demo. Is that typical for Luke, or is that a weird, like, New Zealand kind of microclimate thing?
I think what I was expecting was, I think Luke's audience is young in the in the US. Young and good looking is how I describe them, because I think it's music listeners. I've seen a lot of country audiences. I know what they look like. I think Luke's is broader than that. And so I was expecting to see that mix last night. But yeah, I'm not surprised seeing a young audience. I love bringing people along to the show, people like you, who goes, oh my God, this is young, because it's a real perception shift. Because actually, that is who's consuming country music right now. You know, it's young people. It's a growing, you know, it's not exclusively young people, but it's not what you were expecting, older men in cowboy hats. It's not that. I was excited about that audience. I went out and I interviewed a bunch of people, and it was a very diverse audience as well. And I didn't meet a single Aucklander. Everyone I met. That's
what I'm curious about, right? Like, I was sort of guessing at that. But so where were they from, the people you spoke with?
They had Gisborne, Waikato. People had travelled for 6 hours. Someone had come from Coromandel, someone from Tekapo. The point being, it's a Wednesday night show. You've had to take 2 days off work minimum, do a flight and a hotel.
You're on the hook for $1,000,
yeah.
Easy. So
you're not. Let's talk about the demographic. You've got some money, and you're very committed. And all of these people that I interviewed, you know, it's their first country music show, and they call themselves country music fans, and they're young. And I was like, yep. This is happening in New Zealand right now.
So how are you onboarding them into your machine?
My machine. Well, I really.
You're part of the community. I'm talking about the CMA and all who.
Oh no! I know. I really focus on the industry. I want all of the record labels here. I want to find out that there's passionate people working here, so that so I can basically have a regular touch point with them. Record labels, media. Anyone who's passionate about country music that works in a significant way in the music business who can make a difference, I will put them together in a group, and I call them my country music industry community. And so I want to build one in New Zealand, and I think I found all the individuals on this trip to do that. And I will speak with them. I'll put them on a Zoom call together. They won't be in a room, and we'll have a conversation on a regular basis, and we're going to start to do some stuff together.
So this won't be if this and the Morgan Show felt like they were the coming out parties for New Zealand as a spot on the touring roster, but it won't be the last.
No. Yeah, there's definitely a desire. I think, you said, the Michael Chugg, the promoter, was there last night, and, there's other promoters in this part of the world that are seeing that audience, seeing that fervour, seeing how fast those shows sold out. I think Luke's has been a really interesting one because while Morgan Wallen is a huge artist, he hasn't actually put on a world tour, whereas Luke did. And it's not just New Zealand, but he's sold crazy numbers all over, like Australia, but also Denmark and Norway and Sweden and Germany. So lucky me, I get to go there as well and try and forge together communities to help build the market in those countries as well. So
obviously there is some element of your job is to build out the infrastructure in these kind of fresh locations, but there are also, I think Cappy, Luke's manager last night said in a speech that there was like YouTube comments where he started to realize that there was a really big geography that was available to him that just wasn't particularly being exploited. How much of the CMA or of the country industry is a sort of a big data operation and kind of, or how much of it is just a general kind of feel the heat type thing? It's a bit of both. We want more data. And there are some countries that you can get really great data from their charts system, and that's a really helpful talking point when you can say, which I can say about the UK, that country music's the fastest growing genre there for the last 5 years. So if you say that in a room, you can turn heads, and maybe brands will want to be involved. And it's harder to ignore. I don't have that data yet in New Zealand, but I'm gathering it while I'm here. But as an organisation, yes, data and insights, that is our focus. We've got a great team that are starting to pull that together. And so we can track the consumption around the world and then, look at, which are the top 10 countries that are showing up for country music. That's where we should focus my strategy should be focused around those countries. I mean, and another thing that kind of you could sort of feel radiating out last night was the extent to which Luke was sort of unselfconsciously embracing his role as that tip of the spear for country. And, my daughter Jet, full disclosure, works at Sony, which is Luke's record label. Met him, was just raving about how personal he is. A lot of artists, before they go on stage, that's not their big priority, is to make everyone in the room feel good. The things he was saying about shooting Red Stag, and he got here early and watched an All Blacks game. And, there's just a real sense of him being very comfortable there, which I guess speaks to that community thing. This isn't entirely about him as an individual. It's about what he will do for this industry that's given him so much. How important is it that and then how common is it that the artists actually take on and embrace that role?
I'm feeling terrible that I missed this out on the whole Nashville thing when I was talking about it before, because the fans are just so important. Like meeting your fans beforehand and before the show, that's normal. That's normal. And it's all about, for country artists, it's about, I guess it's about two things, about the songs and it's about the fans. It's meeting them, it's connecting with them. And And I think that's another really nice piece. Like, those artists are brought into the industry and well, they're not taught. That's part of the appeal for them to be in country music. It's a real connection with your fans. So, and you could see that in that room last night. I think there was so much joy in that room. There's a real connection. And I felt it with Luke as well. I feel like I've seen him play stadiums in the US. It's great seeing him in an arena. I think that's probably a perfect sweet spot to sing. Like, New Zealand, you're so lucky that you get to see these big artists in a room that size. Because you could feel, it was just, everyone was having a great time, and he could feel that, and we were all just part of one thing. So yeah, the fan connection is, it's the core of country music.
I'm aware that you're sort of jet lagged, and I'm holding you back from a ferry to Waiheke, which is not a kind thing to do to anyone. But I wondered if we could close on. You've actually touched on it a bit already, but I think that there are lessons, like quite profound lessons, that not actually just music, but any kind of community-based art form can kind of learn from how country has done something which 10 years ago, the idea that, artists would, on their own terms, the country artists would be meeting audiences like this here is pretty, I don't know, it would have seemed unimaginable. What do you think, like, say, whether it's kind of New Zealand, like, setting aside that it's not a genre, but it is a community, whether it's music or film or, any other art form that is striving to leave these shores, what is it, the sort of the core lessons you think are applicable out of what you've learned watching Nashville in motion?
That's a big question.
Yeah, sorry about that. Real chill one to end on.
Well, I mean, I think partly seeing things, like I mentioned before, like the greater good. I think that's also, as you get older, you can make more room for people, and you can start focusing on other people. I know that in our own careers, you probably feel the same. Like, you want to help people succeed. You don't want to just make yourself succeed, And I think Nashville, that is a really nice thing about working in that environment, is that people love seeing each other succeed. It's not a tall poppy syndrome thing. And I think this possibly goes back to American culture and being in a culture where your own culture is reflected back at you 100%. You're not in an environment like we are in New Zealand or any other country where you have a mixed bag of things being reflected back at you, and I think that shapes people differently. Having lived in America now, I'm starting to see how that impacts in a very rounded way. I'm hoping that makes sense.
It makes sense.
So I think collaboration, and learning from each other. It's a weird thing to say, but I've only really just stumbled on the fact that the human experience, what we all have in common, is that we have the ability to learn all of our lives. It doesn't stop. And I think we could learn from each other and be open to people who may not even be at our level in the business, or they might be at a greater level of us in the business, and just being open to learn. So maybe it's that.
That's pretty good. Thank you so much for coming up, Milly. I really appreciate, especially at the end of a long day after a late night. But yeah, it's so interesting to me. And honestly, if you're listening and you get the chance to go and see a big country show, even if you might think that it's not your thing, you'll be surprised, like there's something happening there. And it feels like you've had quite a massive role in it. So I really appreciate you making time to pop by the pod.
Oh, thank you so much. And I love the spin-off, and I love that you've spun off the spin-off to seek joy doing things like this. And I think that's terrific.
Oh, that's so kind. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
That was The Fold, brought to you by our partners at oOh!media, making brands unmissable and public spaces better across Aotearoa. Huge thanks to oOh!media for sponsoring this episode of The Fold and enabling us to make unmissable connections with Kiwis.